All right, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you who are joining. Welcome to our webinar today on engaging suppliers to achieve responsible supply chains. My name is Adrienne Brown. I'm the Senior Operations Manager for the Accountability Framework Initiative's Backbone team, and I'll be moderating today's discussion on this critical topic. Before we get started, I want to draw your attention to a few quick and important points. We'll be recording today's webinar and a link will be emailed to all of you. It'll also be available on the AFI website along with the slide deck. You'll notice that our chat function is disabled for the duration of the webinar, but please use the Q&A function in Zoom to submit any questions that you might have for our discussion. And finally, we will have a very brief post-event survey that'll pop up after we conclude the webinar, and we use this feedback to continuously improve these types of events for the future. So we very much appreciate any feedback you'd like to provide. And with that, I'd like to turn now to our speakers for today's webinar, who'll be sharing their experiences and expertise on the topic of engaging suppliers to achieve responsible supply chains. We have Hope Bristow of Anthesis Group. We have Nadia Haro-Mwara of JDE Peats and Justin Dupre-Harbert of ProForest. And I'd like to invite each of you to come on camera if you're not, introduce yourselves and your work. So Hope, let's start with you.
Sure, thanks, Adrienne. Hi, everyone. Thanks to the AFI team for inviting me here today. My name is Hope Bristow, and I'm a principal consultant at Anthesis Group. Anthesis is a global sustainability consultancy. We are a group of 1,200 plus consultants that operate in 40 countries all over the globe. Our staff have really broad and deep sustainability expertise. I'm joining today from our nature practice, and I lead our Forest Positive team here in North America. Within this service, we advise companies and financial institutions on their journey to create deforestation and conversion-free supply chains. We support all types of companies, from food and beverage retailers to pharmaceutical companies to financial institutions, to really help them set their no deforestation commitments. We help them identify their supply chain risks and assess the impact of their sourcing activities, and just generally offer guidance every step of the way as they work towards their forest positive goals. From the beginning of the development of this service offering, we've always looked to the accountability framework as a guide to support our clients in setting and meeting their no deforestation commitments. And we are happy to say that we've recently joined their delivery partner program. So we really look forward to continuing to do this work and look forward to the discussion today.
Great. Thank you so much, Hope. Nadia, I'll turn to you next. I think you're on mute. Let's see.
Still doing the mute unmute challenge.
Great. We can hear you. Go right ahead.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me here today. So I'm Nadia with a very difficult last name to pronounce, as you can see. I work at JDE Peats as a sustainability director. For those of you who don't know, JDE Peats is the largest pure play coffee and tea company that we have at the moment. We like to talk about in numbers. There's about 4,200 cups of coffee or tea being drunk every second across 100 markets. So in the few seconds that I've been speaking, there's quite a few enjoyable moments of these amazing beverages that have been had by consumers. My role at JDE Peats is within the sustainability team, working on our responsible sourcing strategy. Responsible sourcing is embedded across our business, as is sustainability, and we have 3 pillars. The other 2 pillars closely linked to our responsible sourcing work is minimizing footprint and connecting people. So it's really about the people, planet, profit, if you think about it in the old classic way of describing that. And for us, it's really about, how would I say this, future-proofing coffee for generations to come. We all know that there's a lot of challenges out there, both with regards to environmental and social challenges. And we need we're a coffee company. If there is no coffee being grown in the future, then we cease to exist. And that's why we're really passionate about coffee. It's who we are and what we do. And our belief is that together, through the power of our brands, 50 plus brands, we can actually deliver impactful change and be a force for better. And so happy to talk to you a little bit more about that through the course of this webinar. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Nadia, and looking forward to that discussion. Justin, over to you.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Justin Dupré-Harbord from ProForest. I'm a principal project manager in the Responsible Sourcing Department based in Oxford in the UK. So ProForest is a global organization locally led with a shared mission, and that mission is agricultural and forestry production and sourcing that delivers positive outcomes for people, nature, and climate. So yes, we work both on the consultancy side with companies all across the supply chain, focused on the agricultural and forestry sectors, supporting them on all aspects of responsible sourcing and sustainability across both environmental and human rights concerns. We work with them in terms of setting policies, traceability mapping, risk assessments, taking action in various ways, including supplier engagement, which we'll talk about during this webinar, and also monitoring. At ProForest, we also support a lot of collaboration spaces in this sector, bringing companies and various actors together to address systemic issues, as we know that one company on its own cannot address many of these sustainability issues. And we also work in landscapes on the ground in the areas of production. As you can see here on the slide, we are based around the world in many countries where tropical agricultural production is taking place. And we have local teams there who work directly with producers and with communities and workers on the ground as well as working with downstream companies who are sourcing these materials. We work across various commodities, including palm, sugar, cattle, timber, to name a few. And yeah, very happy to be part of this webinar and sharing our experience also in supporting companies on their sustainability journey and specifically around how to engage suppliers.
Great. Thank you, Justin. Thank you all for that introduction, and really looking forward to hearing more from you during this webinar. I'm going to provide a very brief overview of the Accountability Framework Initiative and a little bit about the guidance that we have around supplier engagement to help set the stage for our discussion. The AFI, for those of you who don't know, is a collaborative program to achieve supply chains that are protective of forests, other natural ecosystems, and human rights. We're led by a coalition of leading environmental and human rights organizations from around the world, whose logos you can see now on the screen. And collectively, we work with companies, civil society, industry groups, and other key stakeholders to support this transition to responsible supply chains in the agriculture and forestry sectors. And to achieve this, essentially, we offer the accountability framework as a practical roadmap for companies around their responsible supply chains. And for the AFI, responsible supply chains means production, sourcing, and financial investments that are free of deforestation, any conversion of natural ecosystems, and that fully respect the human rights of Indigenous peoples, local communities, and workers. And the AFI strongly encourages companies to address both environmental and human rights risks in tandem when they're managing for responsible supply chains, due to both the interdependence of these issues and the production of commodities, as well as the synergies to be gained by doing so. And we'll talk a little bit more about that during this webinar. And finally, the framework is a resource applicable globally for all agricultural and forestry commodities, covering all stages of the supply chain, from producers through to retailers. The framework itself is organized into 12 core principles covering 7 action areas that you can see here on the screen. These 7 action areas comprise the full range of actions that companies typically need to take to achieve and demonstrate responsible supply chains. First, by setting goals, then establishing internal systems to effectively achieve them, and then moving on to implementation, which we break down into managing supply chains and managing production, depending on the company's position in the supply chain. Action areas which are then followed by collaboration and landscape and sectoral initiatives, and then monitoring and verification and reporting on progress. For today's webinar, we'll be zooming into this managed supply chains action area. And specifically, we're going to look at core principle 6 around managing for supply chain compliance. And this core principle states that companies manage their supply chains to proactively address deforestation, conversion, and human rights abuses, identify noncompliance, and resolve such issues expeditiously and effectively. Before we dive in, to take a quick step back and to give you a bit of the rationale for our series on this topic and where we are today with this webinar, the accountability framework identifies 3 levels of necessary action for companies to achieve responsible supply chains. First, at the level of product volume compliance, secondly, at the level of supplier performance, and thirdly, at the level of the sourcing area. And so the first webinar in this series, which took place in September, looked at this first level around product volume compliance. There's a recording of that available on our website in case you missed it. Today's webinar will be looking at managing at the level of supplier performance and around supplier engagement. And the final webinar in this series will be on sourcing area impact, and that will take place early next year. So to help frame today's discussion a little bit, first, when we take a closer look at managing at the level of supplier performance, the focus is really on engaging suppliers to achieve compliance across their entire operations and sourcing portfolio. And this includes volumes beyond what the buyer may be purchasing in any given year. This enables volume level compliance over the long term, for example, if the supplier shifts its supply base, but at the same time, it uses the buyer's leverage to drive progress with the supplier more broadly. And this requires that suppliers have the appropriate policies, systems, and processes in place that cover their entire business and supply base to ensure compliance in production and sourcing, but also adequate monitoring and the ability to furnish the buyer with information on compliance and performance as well. For downstream buyers in particular, supplier engagement is a critical piece of managing for supply chain compliance, and that's what we'll focus more on today. To ensure that supply chain goals are fully implemented, buyers really need to have proactive and sustained engagement with their suppliers. They also need to understand who their suppliers are by mapping their supply chains, and their engagement approaches will need to be tailored to the type of supplier and their position in the supply chain. For instance, if their supplier is a direct supplier, they will need to know that, meaning they sell directly to the buyer, or they would need to know if they have an indirect or intermediary supplier they're dealing with. And this is important to determine both the types of risk posed by these suppliers, as well as the level of visibility and control that the buyer might have to determine compliance of their purchase volumes. Another question is if the supplier directly produces the commodities themselves or if they purchase directly from a producer, because this can tell buyers about the potential influence and control that the supplier may have on how the commodities are produced, and it can help buyers determine how to engage them, for compliance. And finally, another question is whether commodities are sourced from smallholders or larger producers, as this may indicate the types of engagement around capacity building that may be necessary, as well as expectations for the types of control systems that may be in place. And then, so finally, let's look a little bit at the accountability framework's guidance as well, and these key elements of effective supplier engagement, and then we'll turn to hear more from our speakers. So the framework itself outlines 3 main elements of supplier engagement. The first is around clear communication of expectations. And this means that buyers communicate on an ongoing basis to their suppliers and that they are equally receptive to their suppliers' communication as well. They use multiple mechanisms, including supplier codes, sourcing and procurement policies, trainings, and bilateral meetings to ensure this clear communication. And they should also make sure to include documented and communicated criteria around thresholds for noncompliance, which we'll talk a little bit more about on number 3. Secondly, though, first, they need to support and strengthen supplier capacity to meet goals. This is very critical for supplier engagement. Buyers are in a position of where they can leverage their commercial contracts and purchasing with suppliers to influence their behavior, but oftentimes suppliers may as well need additional support to ensure that they are compliant. So where necessary, buyers can start by supporting suppliers to develop their own sourcing policies, procedures, and control mechanisms if they don't already have them. This is especially important where there are indirect suppliers in the supply chain. They can provide capacity building and any technical support, including for indirect suppliers, through the direct ones as necessary and where feasible. And they can include commercial or non-commercial incentives for positive performance to make sure that there are carrots along with the sticks. And thirdly, managing for non-compliance, which is very essential to this process. To do this, buyers would need to consider the severity of the non-compliance when determining the course of action with the aim to retain the suppliers wherever possible. The Accountability Framework's operational guidance on supply chain management has more on key criteria for determining severity of non-compliance. We also talk about engaging suppliers to develop time-bound improvement plans, including necessary remediation, and to monitor these, and also to take consequential action in response to progress made or stalled. So these are the three key components of supplier engagement from the Accountability Framework's perspective. But I think we'd really like to hear more about how this plays out in practice. And for that, today we have both Hope and Nadia to talk to us a little bit about this. So let me turn to both of you. I think first we'd like to start with this question around what supplier engagement looks like in practice. What does it mean when you take elements of this guidance and work with it in your supply chains? How do you start and how do you prioritize activities around this? And Hope, I'd like to turn to you to start this question.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we've found that it's really important, and we've seen the most success if you begin by first engaging with your internal teams, especially getting your procurement teams involved from the beginning of this process. So that might mean first just figuring out who has that direct relationship with your suppliers, who would be best suited to not only engage, but also provide that historical context, particularly when it comes to getting the baseline data needed from your suppliers so that you can assess what kind of action that they're taking to eliminate deforestation from their supply chain. It's also important to educate your internal teams as well on what your goals are, what your expectations are, and develop and provide resources. That could be as simple as developing one-pagers that are readily available for them that they can use and have on hand to provide suppliers with guidance and consistent messaging. We also advise companies to next develop a supplier prioritization strategy. So what this really boils down to is figuring out who your most strategic suppliers are, who are the ones that will have the highest impact on your goals, not only from a spend perspective, but also in terms of deforestation risk. And you can do this by assessing supplier maturity within this space. So this really means just figuring out where your suppliers are on their journey towards no deforestation and no conversion, asking them questions like, have they already committed to a deforestation-free supply chain, for example? Take a look at what kinds of policies and procedures they have in place. Are they tracking their own progress against their commitments? Do they know and understand the regions from which the commodities that you're sourcing from originate? And are these areas at high risk for deforestation? What kind of leverage for change does your supplier have? Do they have field level impact, for example, or are they just a distributor? So really just getting a basic understanding of the types of suppliers. And then last but not least, are they recognizing the importance of addressing human rights abuses as part of their approach to no deforestation? In working with companies in this space, we've really found that not a lot of companies are recognizing the importance of addressing human rights abuses as part of their approach on deforestation. So really just getting an understanding of the profile of your supplier list will kind of help you then prioritize which suppliers to engage with from the beginning.
Thanks for that. Nadia, I'm sure all of this sounds very familiar to you from where you sit. And JDE Peet's being such a global brand, you mentioned over 50 brands and you're sourcing coffee and tea from around the world. What does supplier engagement look like from your perspective? And what are some of the approaches that you're taking with JDE Peet's? I think you're muted. We can't hear you.
Is that
There you go.
There we go. Sorry about that. So yeah, I'd like to echo what Hope just said. I think and actually the AFI framework is really helpful and has helped us a lot on our own journey, starting with your policies and your principles and everything else, and then mapping out your process. But our supply chain, as you said it, if I just look at coffee alone, is as complex as it can get. We're sourcing from, give or take, 30 countries, a lot of coffee. Over 80% of the world's coffee is grown by smallholders. Many of those smallholders are unorganized or unaffiliated into producer groups. You're dealing with different kinds of tier one suppliers. That could be an international trading company, such as the larger ones that we all know of, but also sometimes you're only able to procure coffee in countries through a local exporter. So the levels of knowledge and policies and processes within your tier one supply base is already very different. And so what we did on our journey was really, after getting all of the policies and visions and processes that we wanted to put in place, was really about a baseline, really about data, as Hope also said. So who are our suppliers in each of those sourcing countries? And within a country, there's regions, map that out. What are the specifications of each of the supply chains that we're sourcing from? And along this journey, absolutely critical to take our commercial team along with us, because the first relationship that you have with a supplier is with your commercial team. I may sit somewhere in a sustainability team and have all of these policies and visions, but if I pick up the phone and call a supplier, it's a totally different response if the commercial team calls, because that is where that relationship lies. So we've been really lucky, and we've gone along this entire journey with our commercial team and mapped the suppliers, also mapping suppliers based on volume, spend, and risk. Who are the non-negotiables, who are the suppliers that we have to engage with on an annual basis, and those are all part of our supplier engagement plan. So on an annual basis, we have these supplier engagement discussions with each of these strategic suppliers, and so it's really it's an ongoing process. I can't say it begins at any point in time or ends at any point. To give an example, we just launched we've designed a supplier self-assessment process. While we have independent assessments done of our supply chains, very often is okay, you can do an independent assessment with farm audits and understanding supply chains, but very often it is the supplier who is vertically integrated in the supply chain. They have boots on the ground, they have business on the ground, they know who the farmers are, who the different agents are on the ground, and actually the other ones who are there 365 days of the year versus an independent assessment that is done at some point in time. So we felt it was really important to take our suppliers along this journey through this self-assessment process. And we do three things in this supplier self-assess. First and foremost, it's the responsible business practices. Do you have a policy? At what level does the policy go to? What kind of governance structures do you have for your human rights policy, for your deforestation, for your health, OHS, and all of the things? So that's a general kind of responsible business practices. And then we ask each and every supplier, and in some cases it's a global supplier, but selling coffee to us from 10 different origins. So it will be origin specific. So they will receive a specific questionnaire for each origin. And then they will, in this part of the question, we're checking two things: alignment against our sourcing principles. So we have designed our responsible sourcing principles very much aligned to the common language we have in coffee, which is kind of under the Coffee Sustainability Reference Code under the Global Coffee Platform. And also at that point in time worked very, very closely with Rainforest Alliance as we were designing our Common Grounds program. So we check alignment, how aligned are each and one of our suppliers against these principles, and also what level of risk do they see against each of these principles. And that is a real good sense check. And you will be surprised where an independent assessment says one issue is very high risk. All the suppliers in that specific region say it isn't. So what do you do then? Right? Because you want to map your supply chain, you want to understand, you want to engage your suppliers. And so there, we then often do what we do is a third wheel, which is then a targeted assessment to assess that specific issue, be it a human rights issue or an environmental issue or anything else that popped out within this process. And then this self-assessment that has just gone out, we then engage throughout the year through the annual engagement cycle. So lots and lots happening, but really suppliers are the ones who are mostly, on the ground, available, and need to be highly engaged as if you want to be able to progress on this topic.
Thanks for that, Nadia. That's so illuminating around, the really tells us how complex, the supply chains are. And so the approaches have to be as well, but also all of the different levels at which you're working. You mentioned working closely with your procurement teams being an essential first step. So you have those systems in place internally, but then the level of assessing risk and the assessments and engagements that you're doing as well with your suppliers. What does it look like when you're monitoring and tracking progress then? I'm sure these systems help you to do that. You have them in place, but what does that look like from your perspective? And Hope, would love to hear from you as well, what monitoring and tracking looks like and what are some good practices that you're finding. So Nadia, would you like to start?
Sure, I'll go first. So monitoring and tracking for us is also defining, I don't want to oversimplify, but thresholds, right? So there's, for the supplier engagement with the self-assess, there's a scoring system that suppliers would get after submission. So there's a whole system behind it. And you can easily see a supplier who responds with, we don't know, alert. They don't know what's happening on the ground. And then also the independent assessments on the ground also has an equal score, a similar scoring system to show where the levels of risk. So now we know how a supplier is engaged versus the risks on the ground. We then transparently share with each and every one of the suppliers. And I must say this, when we first started this, we had a response rate of our suppliers of 87%. And our last run of our supplier self-assessment was a whopping 98% response rate of all of our tier 1 suppliers. And I stress the word on tier 1 because the way we buy coffee, we really buy from the trade. We're not buying from individual farmers. And so we need to be able to make sure that we're asking all of the right questions to understand down to the supply chain. But the progressing is, over the years, you're able to define these thresholds of farmers. So we've defined our suppliers into 4 buckets, like those that are leading the pack, those are like well on their way, and then there's, at the very bottom, you have the laggards. And we have then clear, honest conversations with these suppliers in the annual review process of, for those that are doing well done, let's do more of this. How can we work better with you? How can we invest in the issues in the value chain that you're seeing? And those that are lagging behind. In my years at JD Pizza, I don't recall that there was ever one situation where we say that's an immediate cutoff. We will cease working with this supplier. I think that's the worst thing you can do. It's really about continuous improvement. And that carrot and stick is not immediately the stick, but how do we actually progress? And if you see there is repeated no reaction from a supplier, no engagement, then we have our standard operating procedures where we then go into the lead of the commercial team to actually have that stern conversation. So I think walking away from a supply chain or a supplier because of lack of reaction or response is really not the solution. And that's why we've also categorized this. And we're seeing lots of improvement over time of the suppliers moving.
That's great. It's really positive in what you're looking for. Yeah. And Hope, how do you go about advising companies around monitoring and tracking progress? Do you have also some best practices, maybe similar to what Nadia's mentioned, that you advise companies follow?
Yeah, definitely. So in our experience in terms of monitoring and tracking progress, the approach that we advise clients on starting with is really to first determine which monitoring approach you're going to be using based on the level of visibility or traceability you have within your supply chain. So the goal, of course, is to get as granular as possible in terms of understanding the origins of the commodities that you're sourcing, so that you can monitor that area for deforestation risk. So best case scenario is that you have visibility to the actual production site, and then you would be able to use things like remote sensing tools that will allow you to assess risk and monitor deforestation at that level. This will be especially important to meet the EUDR regulation, which is going to require that companies carry out due diligence, which will include providing geolocation data on deforestation linked products that are imported into the EU. But in most instances, especially the companies we tend to work with, they might not actually have traceability information at all. So in that case, we're encouraging companies to take a similar approach that Nadia has spoken to here, which is engaging with their suppliers to better understand what types of management and control systems they already have in place. So are they conducting their own risk assessments? Do they have grievance mechanisms in place? Do they have their own policies and procedures for addressing their own suppliers' non-compliance? So yeah, just super important to collaborate with your suppliers to ensure that they themselves are taking action so that you can then figure out how you can further collaborate with them and support them the best way that you can. And you can do this through a combination of supplier surveys, but also direct engagement. We've found that direct engagement is extremely beneficial. We've seen a lot of success. It might be a bit more time consuming, setting regular touch bases with your suppliers, actually getting on the phone with them, getting them involved in every step of the way. We've seen that as being extremely helpful in terms of affecting change and getting them to engage with you. On the topic of surveys, there is a lot of survey fatigue out there from suppliers. A lot of suppliers are getting different surveys from all of their customers, and they're all asking generally the same thing, and it's caused a lot of fatigue. So selecting a system that is widely available and used, like CDP supply chain, that doesn't perpetuate the survey fatigue, we found is important and useful. If you do choose to survey your suppliers using your own kind of custom survey solution, we think it's really important to make sure that you're simplifying the questions that really fit within your objectives and understand how to really synthesize that captured data. This can really help you benchmark where your suppliers are along their maturity journey and kind of help you track progress against your own no deforestation commitments.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. Yeah, sounds, it's such a complex process in a complex setting of a supply chain. And this engagement itself, all of these processes in place sound like then really are, since they're the same ones you need for this monitoring and tracking progress, they really do set you up for success. And I hope I like what you mentioned about that direct engagement with suppliers as well. So really, taking that time. It sounds like these are certainly issues around which there really are no shortcuts, and it's well worth spending that time and dedicating that effort and those resources to doing it. So in picking up on that too, and more around this how and these steps around supplier engagement, Justin, I'd like to turn to you for a few minutes to talk a little bit about how ProForest approaches this topic, and to highlight a few of the resources that you have for companies around this.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian. And I think Hope and Nadia have almost done most of my talk for me, but I'll try and ultimately build on what they've said. And yeah, I think what I'll present will kind of capture a lot of the points that they've already made. So this is ProForest's supplier engagement kind of standard process that we use with the companies that we consult for. And I'd like to first mention that this is also fully aligned with AFI's guidance on supplier engagement, and the AFI team also supported in inputting thinking to this diagram as well. So yes, building off of what Hope and Nadia have already kind of captured in their points, this is kind of the main generic steps that we advise to companies when they come to us for support on supplier engagement. Again, this is not a comprehensive process, and it's not necessarily like every step flows from one to another. Sometimes these can be in parallel, or the order can be changed. First of all, we do start by advising with companies that they should be doing a due diligence process for selecting new suppliers from the get-go. So even before setting sustainability requirements for existing suppliers and engaging existing suppliers on their sustainability, the team should really be already, before starting to buy from a new supplier, doing some minimum kind of assessment on that new supplier, on really assessing whether that new supplier will fit into the sustainability needs of the company. And this shouldn't be kind of these assessments shouldn't be too extraneous. It shouldn't be about really cutting out all of the suppliers and only selecting the best practice suppliers, the best players. But there should be some kind of minimum due diligence criteria for selecting those new suppliers and making that decision of whether to buy from the supplier or not. And then part of this due diligence, and also a key one that we've seen, is onboarding new suppliers and communicating expectations. So when a new supplier comes in, they really have no idea what the expectations of the company are. And it's a really important key transition point to make sure that those suppliers are correctly onboarded. Then we move on to the ongoing supplier engagement process, which in some ways can happen in parallel if a company has never done supplier engagement and they need to set sustainability requirements for their existing suppliers and communicate those to their existing suppliers. And then once those sustainability requirements have been set, and I guess I should mention again that those sustainability requirements should cover all types of sustainability issues. They should be covering deforestation, conversion issues, as well as human rights, and understanding the interlinkages between those. Once those criteria are set, then as Hope and Nadia have talked about, it's about assessing the suppliers, having that baseline data, and having that baseline understanding of where the supplier sits and what they need to improve on. And then the crucial transition point here is obviously then going back to the supplier with that assessment and communicating the gaps to the supplier and agreeing on a time-bound improvement plan. And I'd like to stress this point because, especially in the past, this is sometimes where we've seen it fizzle out, where there's a lot of resources spent on engaging the suppliers, on getting data and assessing them, but then somehow it kind of gets forgotten that the whole point of that exercise is actually to engage the supplier for improvement, and that if you don't follow up through it, then there's basically no point in doing that assessment in the first place. So that's a point that we really stress as well to our clients, that we will only support in doing those assessments if there is the commitment to actually then go through and engage those suppliers on improvement. So yes, once here talking about step 4, once you've engaged the supplier to set and agree on those time-bound improvement plans, it's then up to the supplier to implement that. And then again, a crucial piece is the buying company should be providing support and capacity building where necessary. And then it's about monitoring and reporting, as Hope and Nadia have talked about reviewing the supplier progress in implementing those improvement plans and taking the correct consequential action in response to that progress. Maybe I'll just pull out a few kind of key learnings here, which really in some of them are a bit of a repetition to what Hope and Nadia have already talked about. But again, getting the procurement team involved in this whole process is key. We have had cases sometimes where we're just talking to the sustainability team, we develop a whole process, and then you go to the procurement team and you realize that this doesn't work for the procurement team. So it's key that the procurement team is fully bought into this, because ultimately they have the most leverage with the suppliers. Then again, it's really important to prioritize suppliers and take a stepwise approach with suppliers by type of supplier. How close are they to the ground? What level of capacity do they have? How knowledgeable are they about sustainability? again, there's no point in going to a supplier with a list of 10 criteria that they need to meet, including developing a grievance mechanism, doing risk assessments, etc., if they haven't even set a policy and haven't even set commitments and don't understand necessarily the issues of sustainability in their supply chain. So it's really important to tailor the engagement approach to their level of understanding and their level of capacity. Not every supplier has the capacity for satellite monitoring or implementing projects on the ground either. Another key point I would say is consistency. Sometimes we've seen that it can be an issue if the procurement practices mean that suppliers are bought from one year and then next year are just dropped, and there's no kind of consistency in that procurement, and then the engagement also drops. So there's no incentive there for the supplier to actually comply with commitments or engage in the supply engagement process if they have no guarantee that they're going to be bought from next year. And again, it's really important that the process, the supply engagement process and the criteria are not constantly changing year from year and confusing suppliers. So it's really important that the whole approach is consistent so that you see that year-on-year improvement from suppliers. Finally, I won't mention it very much again, but providing incentives and disincentives is key. Again, with a focus more on the incentives part, not cutting out suppliers straight away if they're not meeting criteria. Another piece maybe that hasn't been mentioned is working with suppliers in collaboration spaces with peers. So companies collaborating with peers to engage the same suppliers, because a lot of these suppliers are overlapping, creating collaboration spaces with suppliers as well to tackle systemic issues, and also working at landscape and production-based level with those suppliers and supporting programs at that area. And then finally, and this is kind of a segue to my next piece, is obviously, as Hope mentioned at the end there, is don't duplicate the work. Don't duplicate questionnaires when they're already out there. Don't have separate conversations with the same supplier on conversion and deforestation and human rights. Make sure that you're speaking in a coherent way and an aligned way. And when it comes to gathering data from suppliers, I would strongly agree with Hope that we've actually also seen that for many clients, we don't actually send out any questionnaires. We assess suppliers based on public information and then go directly to engagement, because we've seen that there's a lot of questionnaire fatigue out there, and where we can go directly to the engagement and gather more information through the direct engagement, we find that more effective. And I would also say that it's really important to build on existing surveys, as Hope says, that are out there. So when I talk about public information, I don't just talk about the supplier's website. I talk about the surveys that are out there, such as CDP surveys, such as the Palm Oil Transparency Coalition surveys, which many of these companies have access to that data. So gathering that data from that rather than necessarily sending their own individual questionnaire. And maybe to build on this point, this is some work that we have actually taken forward this year with a coalition of organizations in the palm oil sector. So we realized ProForest and a whole bunch of other organizations, which maybe I'll mention quickly, which are Three Keel, who run the Palm Oil Transparency Coalition, CDP, Spot, who do a palm oil, the ZSL, who do a palm oil evaluation called Spot, Earthworm, who also have their own platform for assessing supplies in the palm oil sector, Rainforest Alliance, Transitions, all of these organizations, and ProForest, we have developed various surveys for assessing palm oil suppliers. And particularly, I'm talking here about palm oil traders and refiners, who are in the middle of the supply chain and are key type of supplier to engage. We have all these surveys, and so we realized this year and came together and have done a process to try and align ultimately our questions across these different surveys. So we spent about half a year going through all the different surveys that we have developed and really aligning those questions to come up with one aligned global list of questions for assessing palm oil traders and refiners. And the commitment is from all these organizations is that we will ultimately integrate these questions into our own surveys now. And what we should be seeing next year in the palm oil sector is that all these traders and refiners, although they may be receiving still multiple questionnaires from these different organizations, they will be receiving much more aligned questionnaires from the different organizations. And so that should help them in answering those questions more effectively, really tackle that questionnaire fatigue, and ultimately spend more resources on actually taking action for improvement. I haven't mentioned two other organizations that have been part of this process who don't actually have their own questionnaires but are crucial. And one of them is, of course, the accountability framework. We've made sure to align, and they were part of the group, and we've made sure to align with the accountability framework core principles and work that they've done on a common methodology around deforestation conversion-free cross-commodity, and WWF as well, who are also part of this process. Going forward, we have now this working group, and we also welcome any other organizations who have their own questionnaires or are doing some kind of surveys in the palm oil sector to join. And going forward, we ultimately are trying to move forward towards having one single sector questionnaire for assessing palm oil traders and refiners, so that ultimately these palm oil traders and refiners won't be receiving so many questionnaires from the different organizations, and that we can ultimately just share the data between us to assess those palm oil traders and refiners. The next step is also getting the companies on board. As I was saying, we advise companies to not necessarily develop their own questionnaires where possible. Obviously, sometimes when it comes to gathering specific traceability data, this is needed. But as much as possible, we recommend companies to try and build on the existing resources out there. And again, we're going to be working with companies in the palm oil sector through the Palm Oil Collaboration Group and the Consumer Goods Forum Forest Positive Coalition to encourage and work with companies to align, again, their questionnaires and the way that they're engaging suppliers with this aligned list of questions that we've now developed for assessing palm oil traders and refiners.
Great. Thank you, Justin. Thanks for sharing all of that
Yeah.
and those resources. And I think it's so helpful to see this sort of stepwise approach. It helps to bring all the things we're talking about into a kind of a very concrete, process oriented, visual actually as well. A lot of what we're talking about too keeps coming back to this engagement and incentives, and there's a lot of questions coming in the Q&A about that as well. So I'm glad we're speaking to that already. I wanted to turn to Hope and ask about, when you're setting up these incentives and the like, really what you're trying to do is encourage continuous improvement through suppliers. So you have these goals and you're supporting them through capacity building, direct engagement, and the like. I'd love to hear from your perspective, what are some of the ways that you go about encouraging this continuous improvement, and what have you seen from your work that is particularly effective?
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that. We've seen that a lot of companies are frustrated that their suppliers are not very aligned with their company commitments, and they're maybe failing to act, and it's difficult to convince them to act. So where we've seen success with this issue is when companies develop a supplier engagement program that really encourages continued improvement from their suppliers. And they do this through developing incentive mechanisms, as well as just supporting them throughout the process and kind of meeting them where they're at. So this might look like providing them with knowledge and information on topics related to your no deforestation commitment and strategy, similar to what I spoke to regarding supporting your internal teams, also supporting your suppliers, providing them with some basic resources they can use, host trainings on these topic areas, have regular one-on-one engagements, especially for those suppliers that are prioritized for engagement, providing them with some more tailored support and coaching, and just knowledge sharing with them what has worked really well for you in the past. But then speaking specifically to incentives, this has also proven to be fairly successful as well. So actually developing an incentive program, which might include simply recognizing the suppliers that are conducting best practice and leadership in this space. So as simple as sending a congratulatory email from leadership, calling out suppliers in a newsletter that you might have, or sharing different case studies that you've developed with suppliers. We've also seen companies develop supplier benchmarking or scorecards that are then shared back with suppliers, showing kind of how everyone is performing against each other, anonymized, of course, but this tends to stir up a little competition, we found. You might also develop a preferred supplier program. So this is where you're actually deforestation related considerations are added to a preferred supplier decision-making process during the onset of the RFP or just onboarding suppliers to begin with. You could also set up certain commercial benefits like shorter payment terms and things like that. So really just thinking about what would work best for your business and what your suppliers would respond to best can certainly help you determine what would be the most effective way to encourage that continued improvement.
Great, thank you. It's really helpful, and thank you for mentioning all of those specifics. And it sounds like building all of those into a program would be really effective. And just recognition, as you mentioned, Hope, can go a long way, and that's really a part of that, the key piece of engagement. Nadia, I have a question for you as well around from JDE Pete's experience. What are some of the different challenges you've experienced when you're working with larger suppliers and aggregator versus smaller ones? How do you approach working with suppliers at these different scales?
Thank you. Thanks for the question. So yes, I think I also mentioned that we're working with different types of suppliers, and indeed, while the more international suppliers and trading houses, if you want to call them that, have embedded sustainability strategies and policies and everything in place, and have been doing fantastic work for a lot of years. I think also because of the exposure to different end buyers. That's fairly simple. They have a dedicated sustainability team. They probably even have all of these questionnaires already filled, and so there's a way of just transferring their forms into a platform and export the data. So that's fairly easy, I will say. And I think the more important, the more engaging work comes in when you're working with the smaller exporters in a country that are not working across borders. And there you really need to spend the time and the effort, I think. And it's a little bit like, I think, I don't know if it was Justin or Hope who just said it, is there's no point in asking them about their grievance mechanism or their remediation plan when they don't even have policies in place, right? So what we've been doing then is knowing that this is a strategic core supplier in a country. We're going to work with them over a longer period of time. So we're talking about a longer partnership, 5-10 years down the line, and over the years, like, continuously improve. So okay, and explain the reason we need you to have a policy on deforestation is because it's in our responsible sourcing strategy, and we need to be able to be assured of this. That means you need the policies. That means you need some geolocation mapping. Do you need support on this? How about communicating? I mean, can we communicate with somebody who is dedicated to this topic? And we've seen amazing results with some of our local exporters in some of the countries we're working in. If I would compare how we started the journey 8 years ago to today, it's a tremendous shift. And actually, if you think about it, it's even more so important to work with the local exporters because they're usually family businesses, local communities, and they've been there for several years, will continue to be there, are employing local people, and will not just kind of move on when the trend goes away. So that's really important that you take the local exporters on this journey. So I think it's a two-way approach here. I'm not saying that the international suppliers don't need support, and it's a different level of support and engagement, but you need to be able to weigh the two out and see how you engage at different levels.
Great. Thanks, Nadia. And I know I feel like we could keep talking about this topic for another hour, if not more. There are more questions pouring in, and I want to make sure we get to one more before we have to wrap up. And this is around the use of existing established voluntary standards to set requirements for suppliers. Of course, the Accountability Frameworks guidance itself builds off of these voluntary standards that have been around for quite a while now. Justin, if I can turn to you quickly to address this, and then Hope would love to see if you'd like to add anything in before we wrap up. So Justin, over to you.
Yeah, sure. And I should stress that, supporting these voluntary standards and supporting certification is also a key part of a company's responsible sourcing work and journey. And it kind of depends on each individual company how certification fits into their responsible sourcing strategy. So yeah, it can be a key part in terms of if a company, basically commits to buying 100% certified volumes of a certain commodity, and especially if those certified volumes are kind of segregated, not on a mass balance basis. However, it's also important to recognize where these certification standards or these voluntary standards apply. So, for example, if we're talking about many of them in commodity production, including in palm oil, a lot of the standards apply at that production level. So, if you're a downstream company, yes, you should potentially buy certified volumes as part of supporting change at the production level. But you also need to know what's happening with your tier one suppliers and what your tier one suppliers are doing in terms of their responsible strategy. And so that's where these questionnaires or this assessment of your tier one suppliers comes in. It's not replacing certification. Maybe you want to push your tier one supplier to also commit to certification, but it's about assessing how your tier one supplier is doing on their responsible sourcing journey as well. There's also, certain certification standards which apply not just at production level, and it's important to see how those fit in as well. For example, SMETA, you can also be applying that. Again, a lot of that certification applies to the tier one's facility itself. It doesn't necessarily always apply to the tier one supplier's responsible sourcing strategy. So I think here we're talking a lot more about looking at those tier one suppliers' strategies around how they're sourcing and the sourcing practices that they have, rather than the actions that they're taking in their own facilities, which is a lot where those voluntary standards apply more. Although I will say, some of those voluntary standards do delve into that responsible sourcing piece and talk about sometimes sourcing practices, but a lot of them are focused around the practices at either the farm level or the facility level.
Great, thanks. Hope, anything to add?
Yeah, no, I would definitely pretty much echo everything that Justin has just spoken to. Maybe one thing to highlight is really just that certification really can help you strengthen and demonstrate your sustainability performance. But it is part of a comprehensive approach to achieving deforestation-free supply chains. So the system itself can be used to verify that the origins of those commodities are either known or controlled to an extent that they comply with no deforestation, as they can typically link supplies to an origin where that production unit has been audited to confirm adherence to the standard that then aligns with those no deforestation requirements. But we always advise companies that it's not a green lane to compliance. So it's a good idea to assess all of the certification systems and verification systems that you are utilizing and benchmark them against the accountability framework, for example. So before using that as a tool to help you verify your compliance, you should really assess those certification standards. Do they include requirements on no deforestation? Do they require risk assessments? What types of traceability does it provide you to the field level? What types of implementation systems are in place? Take a look at how suppliers are managed throughout the system. Look at land management and remediation and all of the monitoring and verification that occurs, because they're not, just because you see that seal or that certification scheme, you really kind of have to dig deep to assess, how well it kind of stacks up against what your goals are for no deforestation and no conversion.
That's great. That's so helpful, Hope. Thank you. Yeah, those details are so important, and you have to make sure that any voluntary standards or tools or anything else that you're using are in alignment with the commitments you've made or other, regulations that you are looking to comply with as well. Again, I wish we had more time for this. It's been such an interesting discussion. I want to thank Nadia and Hope and Justin for joining us today and for, taking this deep dive with us into this topic of supplier engagement. It's been really great to have all three of you. Thank you also to our participants for the many questions that you've thrown in. We hope that this has been useful. Before we go, I want to highlight a couple of key resources for you on the AFI website, including our how-to guide on writing a supplier code that's aligned with the accountability framework, and also to highlight that we have an e-learning platform on the accountability framework that is launching next month. And so stay tuned for that, because that will be a key resource to dive deeper into some of these topics as well. And finally, you'll receive a recording of this. Please take our post-event survey as we conclude the webinar, and you'll have a chance there to sign up for the AFI newsletter as well if you're not already and would like to continue to receive news from us, including about the third webinar in the series that'll be coming up next month. And finally, if there are any burning questions you still have about this, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at contact@accountability-framework.org. We would be happy to speak with you and answer any further questions. So without any further ado, thank you again to our panelists for all of you joining, and wishing all of you a wonderful rest of your day or evening. Thank you.